Well, good morning, colleagues, and to our witness, Kat Little, Permanent Secretary to the Cabinet Office and Chief Operating Officer for the Civil Service. Ms. Little, you're very welcome. This is, as you probably know, so I think that we need to agree terms of reference of mutual gentle handling. This is our first public meeting as a committee, so it's rather exciting from our point of view. And I think I'm correct to say it's your first meeting before a select committee in your current role.
It is.
So this is a morning of firsts. And so you're very welcome, and thank you for finding the time to see us. I'm going to kick off the questions. Could you set out in sort of brief bullet points, I suppose, your priorities for both delivery and for change as Permanent Secretary to the Cabinet Office?
Of course, and thank you so much for spending some time with me this morning. It's a pleasure to be here. So, hard to do in bullet points, but I'll do my best to summarise. As you pointed out, I have two jobs, yes. And they are in...
I'm going to ask about the civil service job as my sort of second question, so we'll just focus on the Perm sector.
They are somewhat linked, but
right.
For the Cabinet Office, there are three big things. Firstly is making sure that we are a strong centre of government with Treasury and number 10. And what do I really mean by a strong centre of government? Well, one, it's making sure that we've got long-term strategic capability. It's making sure that we reshape what we do around the government's new priorities, and we've done quite a lot of that already. But that takes time. You don't just do these things overnight. And also making sure that we are doing only what we can do. The Cabinet Office has become a very different sort of organisation in recent years. So I think we need to get back to what the core parts of the Cabinet Office should be. The second thing is culture and people. When I came into this role, it became very clear to me that we've got a significant set of cultural challenges in the department. We have very high bullying, harassment and discrimination scores, and we have had a significant dip in our people engagement scores, which I'm pleased to say we're now recovering from, but we're still tackling some of those challenges. I also need to make the department less bureaucratic and more of a systems leader for the whole of government as part of that cultural change. And that really links to the third thing, which is, given we are the heart of mission delivery, we are the ultimate systems leader. So, you know, we set the tone for the whole of government and how mission-led government operates. And that means changes to culture, how we work with departments, how we set the tone for the whole of the state, and making sure that we role model the whole of the mission approach.
Just following from that, you mentioned at the top of your answer the Treasury, number 10, and the Cabinet Office. When the chips are down and the sleeves are rolled up, is the Cabinet Office number 10's department, the Treasury's department, or is it the honest broker between the two?
So, it's a good question, and there are different dynamics at different times and on different subjects, but I've obviously worked in both the Cabinet Office and the Treasury for a long period of time, and I think the centre works best when there is absolute transparency and clarity about the outcomes that we're trying to achieve, and that we harness the skills of the whole of the centre of government to deliver good, objective, impartial advice for decision makers. And ultimately, the Prime Minister is both the First Lord of the Treasury and the Prime Minister and the final decision maker, and it's our job to make sure that we facilitate the best possible advice for him.
Most ministers, after about 4 minutes in the job, will say that the great slayer of dreams, change, innovation and improvement is His Majesty's Treasury, put on earth as the sort of frustrator. And they like to frustrate because it's the big department of government and they have the checkbook and the PIN numbers. How does the Cabinet Office work alongside other departments in order to move and turn the dials of Treasury to get them to deliver?
So, Treasury obviously has a really important role overseeing the whole of the public finances and the economy, and so ultimately they need to be factual, and we very much support them in doing the very difficult job that they have. And fundamentally, our job is to make sure in the Cabinet Office that there's collective agreement on policy, that we're clear about the outcomes the overall government is trying to achieve, and then to work with the constraints and the parameters which Treasury rightly set down for us so that we can set out the trade-offs in delivering policy outcomes. So I very much see the Cabinet Office as being both the broker for collective agreement, and we do that in a very objective way, but also to make sure that we elucidate the trade-offs, whether they are financial or otherwise. In my experience recently, it's not money that is the only difficult constraint. It's deliverability, it's the feasibility of the capacity of our supply chains, it's how we work in partnership and some of the other constraints that we have around us. So our job is to bring all of that together and to set out the choices.
My supplementary on this is sort of trying to establish how good you are at saying no, because the Cabinet Office has, over recent years, become a sort of receptacle for things which some slopey-shouldered departments say, oh, this is a bit tricky, or, well, we're not quite sure about that. Oh, we'll send it to the Cabinet Office. The Cabinet Office is the great sort of black hole that sucks in any difficult problems. One thinks of contaminated blood, one thinks of RAC, a whole range of things which seems to get dumped on the Cabinet Office, which doesn't accrue in terms of resource, either budget or people, which then means people have to be taken off different things to do. In order to maintain focus on delivery, both of policy and change in mindset, you're going to have to, along with the Chancellor of the Duchy, learn to say no to others in government who see you as the sort of great recycling department.
Well, I very much agree with that. And the interesting thing about the Cabinet Office is, over the last 15 years or so, we've gone from being quite a traditional secretariating function, leading on state strategy and collective agreement, through to now being the HQ for government, more akin to what you would see in the private sector. And as you say, we do end up being the place where, if no one else puts their hand up and you want something done in the centre, well, of course.
Oh, we go, the Cabinet.
And there are certain things where I think it's absolutely right and proper. And you mentioned in infected blood. So one of the first things I did when I came into the Cabinet Office is look at, where should we be leading the operational delivery of payments and casework for infected blood. It was absolutely right not to put it in the Department of Health. And I felt that it was such a critical, high-stakes, important issue that it was only right and proper that the centre of government took the lead on it. But that's not to say that we don't also say, no, we're going to have to. As you say, we've got tight fiscal constraints. And the key to it is ruthless prioritisation and making sure we've got an exit strategy. So, the Infected Blood Compensation Authority, I hope, will make payments quickly, expediently, and is actually a short-term body. It's, not intended to be there as a long-lasting feature of what we do. I think one of our challenges has been we've not had an exit strategy for many of the things that we've started to do, and we need to stop that.
Thank you. And then the same question, delivery and change priorities as COO for the civil service, and a comment, obviously we heard, was it just yesterday, of Sir Chris's appointment as the incoming new Cabinet Secretary. We'll obviously be wanting to see him early in the new year and wish him well in that challenging post. But whether you're able to say at this juncture what you see the division of responsibility being with a new Cabinet Secretary coming in.
Absolutely. Well, we are obviously delighted, and I'm personally delighted to see Chris's appointment. We've worked together for many years and have very complementary skills. The Cabinet Secretary role is broadly split into three parts. So you've got the Prime Ministerial advisory roles on all subjects, whether that's national security, economic or domestic policy. There are some significant constitutional roles, including relationships with the royal household and Parliament. And then thirdly, there's the head of the civil service role, and Chris will be undertaking the same breadth of responsibilities. And in practice, no single person can undertake all of those things on a day-to-day basis. And so the key to it is how the team around the Cabinet Secretary operates. The division of labour with my role is threefold, really. One, I support the Cabinet Secretary to deliver their advisory responsibilities, so I need to make sure that they've got the resources, the people, the skills, the capacity to discharge their work, and that's mainly in my role as Cabinet Office Permanent Secretary. And then in their role of the head of the civil service, of course the Prime Minister and the head of the civil service have to set the strategy for both reform and delivery. But a lot falls to me day to day to deliver and to turn the strategy into implementation and to make sure that operationally the civil service is operating effectively day to day. And then the third bit about my role...
Sorry, just on that, would you be sort of instigating thought pieces for their consideration based on real-time experience and evaluation?
Absolutely. It's one of the things that I spend a lot of time doing, alongside my brilliant teams as well. So, we don't just develop thought leadership within the civil service. We're constantly talking to think tanks, academics, international counterparts to make sure that we're staying up to speed. But it's my job to make sure that we can hear that and stimulate debate. And I think particularly now for the civil service, we are at an inflection point. We've got some big challenges. And I simply think, doing nothing and not looking at some of the sustained big challenges that we've got, it's just not sustainable. The third bit of my role is a distinct role as accounting officer of the department. That has in the past at times been undertaken by the Cabinet Secretary, but not in this current configuration. So I'm a head of department and I'm responsible for everything that we do. And of course the Cabinet Office serves the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, and we also deliver services for the whole of government and the state. So I'm responsible for all of the work of the Cabinet Office collectively.
Final one from me at this juncture. You mentioned the people that you're having conversations with, think tanks, academics, looking at international comparisons. The Prime Minister calls you up and says, right, which one country, if we want to deliver change on a massive, deliverable, cost-effective scale, which one country should we be looking at closely and seeking to emulate in terms of how they deliver that in a civil service capacity? You've got the globe in front of you, it's spinning round. Where does your finger stop?
Well, it depends on what issue, but definitely Singapore is stand out for some of the major transformation it's achieved. And actually, the equivalent to me and the head of the civil service in Singapore came to spend a week with myself and Simon and permanent secretaries earlier this year. And they said to us, you know what, we stole a lot of what you did 10 years ago and then we just made it better. So we're now looking at what we can steal from Singapore and make even better. But, of course, we've turned to Estonia for digital transformation. We talk very regularly with other G7 economies. I think it's more helpful to look at some of the countries that have more similar parliamentary democratic arrangements because we have similar approaches to how you actually get stuff done, so Australia and Canada and New Zealand in particular, and of course very close working with the United States as well.
Well, thank you for that. If for nothing else, you've given us a lot of very interesting destinations to consider that the committee might wish to visit. You may very well be on commission from their tourist boards. If you are, that's none of my concern. Let's turn to Lauren Edwards. Lauren.
I'm going to Singapore in January.
Right. Well, we send us a postcard. Lauren.
Thank you, Chair. You touched on this a little bit already in terms of the breadth of the Cabinet Office's work. I believe your predecessor told this committee that the Cabinet Office's terrific heterogeneity made it a challenging department to lead and to work in, and that also meant that it lacked a strong identity as a consequence. I'm just wondering if you agree with that and how much of a challenge that will be for you in the new role.
Well, I very much agree with my predecessor, and I agree with him on many things that he said to this committee. I suppose if you look at the construction of the Cabinet Office, it's set up as 40 distinct groups within what it does, and it ranges from the National Security Secretariat right through to how we run UK security vetting. So it has a vast range of things, and I suppose in business terms it operates like a conglomerate. which, if you were starting from scratch and thinking about whether that was the operating model you wanted at the heart of government, you might not design it that way. So I very much agree. And there are big challenges that come with this. And, I'm sure you'll want to talk about some of our people engagement scores. It's very clear to me that my staff are saying it's quite hard to have a common Cabinet Office purpose when you can't sum up in a sentence what we're here for, that everyone can relate to. And I very much personally believe that organisations typically work best where you've got focus, a small number of priorities, and you're really clear about what you're trying to achieve so that you can galvanise the whole of the workforce to deliver. So, we really have to reshape the department around the new government's priorities. We are going to have to focus in on only what we can do. And because of the tough fiscal constraints as well, we do need to ruthlessly prioritise and stop doing some things. So we're currently in our business planning process, and we will shortly be saying more about what we will do about it.
I mean, in terms of, 40 distinct groups is incredible for a single department. Are you looking at sort of restructuring? What are your kind of thoughts about how you will go through that process of sort of reshaping the department so that it is more focused?
We've already gone through a number of machinery of government changes, which I'm sure you've seen. There are 5 currently underway, ranging from the move of 1,500 of my digital and technical experts over to DSIT, right through to bringing into the Cabinet Office the government car service. So we are already restructuring and reshaping what we do. I think structures are only part of the answer, though. A lot of it comes down to how we work together, the culture, the processes, and the strategic objectives. And in business planning, that is the moment where you set out what resources have you actually got to deliver things well. And I think far too often we stretch our resources to deliver too much, and that means you're inherently compromising all of the time. So structure's part of it, but not all of it.
Anything else?
Yes.
Thank you. Richard Baker. Richard.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you. I've got a couple of questions related to some of the points that you've just been making and regarding the business planning process, which I'm interested to hear about, because I think you suggested previously that the Cabinet Office should attempt to exert less control over other departments than has been the case, and to focus only on those things that need to be done at the centre. So could you outline, and perhaps this will be part of the business planning process, what things has the Cabinet Office previously been doing that it shouldn't do, what they need to do less of, and how should that focus be achieved?
So perhaps just stepping back a little bit, I think there's always a bit of a philosophy about how you want your corporate centre to operate in any organisation, and the civil service is no different to any other private sector or large public sector body. And these things tend to go in cycles. You tend to have, tight and loose moments depending on what you're trying to achieve. And the Cabinet Office has always got to work out where is the balance between leading and directing, and where we need to be quite muscular, as opposed to where do we need to support and facilitate. And depending on the subject, depends on where that balance is. And that is very much set by the cultural tone politically of the government in our instance. And my personal view is that decisions are best made closest to the people who are actually realising the impact of those decisions. Like proximity to the business and the impact is an important factor that we need to take into account. So there are two things. One is the way in which we operate, and then there are some specific things. So in the way that the Cabinet Office operates, I am very, very keen that we shift our balance to an increased level of facilitation and enablement on the tone and the way in which we operate. I talked about missions briefly. Missions will succeed because we've both held to account and set the direction and the strategy, but that we have also solved some of the big challenges collectively with government and the state, so that we can actually allow the front line of the public sector and departments to succeed in themselves. A very specific area that we are looking at is spending controls. So quite often people think about control in the Cabinet Office because of the delegated controls that we have from the Treasury. And for those of you who haven't had the pleasure of experiencing a Cabinet Office control, it can range from everything from, if you want to set up a new communications or marketing campaign, right through to the biggest investment decisions that we are undertaking jointly with the Treasury. And I think some controls can be very effective in reducing cost and driving value for money. But quite often how you exercise those controls can create unnecessary bureaucracy and can slow down decision making. So you asked about, one of the things that I would change, it's spending controls and the way in which we operate them, and that's a joint piece of work that we will do with the Treasury.
And Lord Maud has made specific recommendations along these lines in his review, The Civil Service Accountability and Governance, which was published last year. And he suggested, in terms of that accountability departments around spending, creating an Office of Budget and Management to integrate cross-departmental resource allocation and programme implementation oversight. But he also suggested that there needed to be a different approach to strategic direction in government as well, by restructuring the Cabinet Office and the Prime Minister's Office into a unified Office of the Prime Minister and Cabinet for clearer strategic direction. So what's your response to that proposal to create that separate secretariat and corporate components of the Cabinet Office into separate departments?
Well, firstly, I've huge admiration and respect for Lord Maud, and I've talked to him over many years about how he has discharged some of the biggest changes to the centre of government, and especially in relation to functions and professionalism and efficiency for what we do. And so I am very, very firmly fixed on making sure we evolve and continue to deliver those things effectively. When it comes to structure, as I said earlier, I'm not always convinced that structural change is the thing in itself. And of course, those sort of structural decisions are for the Prime Minister and the government of the day. And Lord Maud is not the only person who's got a view about the structure of the Cabinet. When I came into this role, I've obviously read...
Are you going to be brave enough to tell him that, or am I?
I'm very happy to tell Lord Maud. We've recently had, for example, the IFG commission into the centre of government. And I think my observation would be we're very good at setting out the problems, and there are lots of possible solutions. And I think the way we do it, as well as the structure, really matters. But fundamentally, it is about making sure that the way we work at the centre of government is more joined up, more strategic, more clear about what we're trying to achieve, much more focused, and that we are relentlessly focused on delivery and high performance. I think everyone in the civil service wants the centre of government to be clear about direction and to help them. That's the most important thing.
As you say, it wasn't only Lord Maud who came forward with these recommendations. The IFG found that institutions like the Cabinet Office are bloated, unfocused and poorly coordinated, while Number 10's underpowered, yet overly involved in operational details. And they also suggested structural change as well, but you're pushing back on that, saying you don't think there is structural change required in the Cabinet Office.
I think structure is part of the answer in terms of improving what we do. I suppose what I'm not saying... So I'm not saying that structure isn't part of it. I think there are specific structural choices which only the government can make choices about.
What advice would you give them in making that kind of structural change?
Well, I'm not going to share.
Okay, fair enough.
Just between us.
It's worth a go, Chair.
No, I mean, the sorts of questions and considerations, you've got to start with outcome and what you're trying to achieve. We need to look at what is the most important thing that the government wants the centre to do and to prioritise. And then we need to make sure that the skills, the capability and therefore the structures are in place to deliver. And I think this government has already made some significant choices in all three of those areas.
Thank you.
Any other colleague on that? No, thank you. In which case, forgive me, John Grady.
I guess to just approach the question in a different way, I suspect what you're saying is, rather than talking about structures all the time, we need to put the emphasis on culture, shared objectives across government departments and skills, and endless reorganisations you might see as somewhat of a distraction from those tasks. Have I understood you correctly?
So I think some structural change is necessary. It always is. But structural change for structural change's sake, I think is a danger. And it's very easy to reach to structural answers. You know, it's simple. It's a very attractive formulation to some of the big problems that we've got. But I think your sister committee, the PAC, did quite a lot of work looking at machinery of government changes and the cost and the implications. They are big exercises, and you know, I've got 2,000 members of my staff currently subject to machinery of government changes on a human level. That is a lot to ask of our people when we're also delivering difficult, complex things for the country. So I think you've got to get the balance right between structure, culture and process.
So to crystallise or distill, is it your assessment that there is flexibility within the skill set of the civil service to deliver the very significant step changes in policy delivery which the Prime Minister and the Cabinet have set out over recent weeks, without resorting to a fundamental machinery of government review to ensure that the machine is fit for purpose to deliver, rather than retrofit to the existing framework new demands?
So, and I'm sure we'll come on to some of the skills gaps in the civil service. I think for the Cabinet Office, we have got a brilliant team of people cohered around the government's priorities, and you know, we've created a new mission delivery unit with new leadership. We've got, as you've seen, lots of new leaders and new teams coming from not just parts of the civil service, from other parts of the public sector, from the private sector, coming to build that capability and capacity. So I'm confident that we have got the people in place. But there are some big challenges in some of the deficits that we know we've got in the civil service. And that's not about structure. Yeah. That's about how we ensure that the civil service is an attractive and competitive, high-performing place to work.
We will, as you've indicated, we will come on to that, I think, in later questions. I want to try and deal with that as a separate thematic, if that's okay with you. Let me turn now to Luke Taylor. Luke.
Thank you. Obviously, we've heard a lot of 5 missions from the government. Can you explain a little bit, and you've spoken about structures, you've spoken about culture, slightly alarmingly, you've spoken about 40 bodies within the Cabinet Office. What impact has this 5 mission expression of the bigger picture, what impact has that had on the Cabinet Office and then by extension the civil service?
And I should just say it's 40 business units, not bodies. We have a much smaller number of ALBs and arm's length bodies. So first off, just a little bit about what we've done administratively, and then what does it mean for both us and the rest of the civil service. So I've mentioned the creation of the new mission delivery unit. We've now got Clara Swinson as the second permanent secretary leading that unit, and there's been a lot of change in rebuilding capability and capacity within that team. We've got the mission boards. They are up and running, and I'm conscious that the kind of governance and the wiring of how we do this might not be immediately observable.
Specifically on that point, you say up and running, so have they been constituted?
They have, yes, okay. And every mission board is led by a Secretary of State. There is a very senior lead official appointed on a cross-cutting SRO basis. They're not there to represent their departments, they're there to represent the system. And the membership and the terms of each of those boards have been set up, and they're up and running and have been for several weeks now. And we've also had routine prime ministerial stock-takes. So there is a whole range of machinery that is gearing and driving activity. I think the interesting, and obviously tomorrow we've got the plan for change, yes. Which will set out, as has been trailed in advance of tomorrow, the very specific priorities over the course of the Parliament. But I think to your question about what does it mean for the Cabinet Office and what does it mean for the rest of the civil service, and several committees, including this one, have looked at the challenges of systems leadership. We have got to systematically break down the barriers to cross-cutting delivery. And there are lots of barriers. We tend to revert to our departmental and organisational silos under pressure. There are challenges with how we undertake decision making, where the accountabilities lie, how we monitor performance and delivery. So we are looking at every single part of how we incentivise, reward and performance manage systems leadership across the whole of the civil service.
So these mission boards are effectively the structure that is being used to deliver that cross-departmental working?
They are, yes.
Okay. Plus the breaking down of barriers, so it's almost, using those boards to drive that utilisation of skills and priorities between the departments.
Absolutely right. It's the what and the how,
Yeah.
and how we change our processes to ensure that we're on track, whilst also setting out some of the trade-offs, and also making sure that we unblock barriers as we go is a really important part of what the Cabinet Office is doing.
Just before the boards that you've referenced there, the membership of them, terms of reference under which they work, the agendas and the minutes, do you see merit in all of that being in the public domain?
Well, that's obviously a choice for ministers.
What would your if a minister was to ask you your advice on that matter, what would your advice be?
We don't normally put minutes into the public domain, particularly on some of these quite sensitive commercial policy development areas. I think it's important to be publicly transparent and accountable, but I'm not entirely convinced that minutes and terms of reference are the best way to do that.
Membership, and when they meet in the public domain, would I think give this committee and Parliament more widely comfort?
Again, I'm not sure that is the best way to drive accountability and transparency.
It's not necessarily a way of driving. It's not necessarily a way of driving accountability, but great play has been placed perfectly properly on a mission-led government. There is always concern amongst practitioners of the fleetness of foot and flexibility of the machine, both from a political and parliamentary side and from civil service side, to respond to a very new, dramatic dynamic. Some understanding of the regularity of meetings and the skill set which input into those meetings, I, in broad terms, take your point about the minutes, would I think be of both interest to and also comfort to Parliament to know, this is not just something that meets once a quarter if there's nothing on the telly at 3:30 on a Thursday afternoon.
Well, I'm very happy to take back your views and as I said earlier, I mean, fundamentally that is a choice for ministers, not for
But do you see the merits of the request? I understand entirely that it would be the Chancellor of the Duchy's ultimate decision, but transparency.
Well, I completely understand why, and it's the most commonly asked question to anyone in the Cabinet Office right now is, what is it all about, and when do we hear more? And people are excited by it and they want to understand it and to get more understanding of what the priorities and the way in which we're operating are. So that's part of it. So I do understand why you are suggesting it. Yes.
This is a committee. It's public administration is one of our key scrutinising functions, and if the appetite for mission-led change is great, and it is, and the pace of delivery doesn't match that, we would have a criticism, I'd suggest to you, as a select committee to say well, you meet on a fortnightly basis, and the meetings are, you've got 30 people on it and so on and so forth, gosh, the pace of change is really rather slow. But if it's only meeting twice a year, and there's only 2 people on it, let's not be at all surprised that the pace of change delivery is actually then rather slow. So I think for us to manage expectation of scrutiny, to actually know what we are scrutinising, would be enormously helpful to this committee.
I completely understand that, and I hope you know I'm massively in favour of transparency and scrutiny.
Indeed, yes.
Look, I mean, to the extent I can assure you now, I mean, the mission boards are meeting regularly. There's a lot to work through at pace. So these are far from irregular discussions. This is almost a weekly occurrence, let alone all of the work that goes into it with our teams and departments. So we can give you a sense of that. More than happy to.
Thank you. Richard, forgive me, Luke, had you finished your line of questioning?
Yes, I think so, yeah.
Okay, Richard Quigley wanted to come in on this.
Thank you, Chair. Just 2 additional questions on missions. Is like all good initiatives, it's very exciting to start with. So, firstly, what is the department doing to prevent it just becoming a top-down activity? So it's done to rather than with. And what are you doing to keep the missions as missions rather than turn them into a list of tasks, which quite often happens?
Well, firstly, it is so important that the missions are widely understood, and my teams are operating in completely different ways. So really getting the input from a much broader, more diverse set of stakeholders than ever before. And I think that ability to develop policy and to shorten the policy development approach between the centre of government and local communities that are impacted is right at the heart of what needs to change. And it's not just missions, the 5 missions, it's everything that we do in the civil service. So, the constitution of the boards, but actually the way in which our mission delivery teams are operating is very, very different. And I suppose to your second point, I think you were sort of talking about how do we stop these from sort of becoming unfocused and losing traction over time. These are obviously very long-term, big, complicated things which we shouldn't be judging in weeks, we should be judging in years. But it is exactly the job of the Mission Delivery Unit to maintain that focus on outcomes. And I really passionately believe in strategic outcome-based performance management, delivery and policy development. Far too often we drive things from inputs and short-termism. So, you will judge when you see the plan for change tomorrow, but that is the attempt to set out very prioritised strategic outcomes and to demonstrate what focus looks like in how we deliver and performance manage impact.
Thank you.
Anything else, Rush?
No, that's fine, thank you.
Just a quick query with regards to public bodies. You'll be aware the most recent review process for public bodies, launched in 2022, has reportedly been completed. What have been its outcomes?
Well, firstly, we should start with just a little bit about the range of public bodies. And I know you are a bit of an expert on...
Well, I wouldn't say that, but we have a growing area of concern with regards to the quantum and growth of public bodies. But that will be subject to a separate inquiry, which doubtless we will invite you to
hear from me.
Share your views.
I mean, just to share a few views on public bodies, because I've been working in this space for quite a long time, both in the Treasury and in previous roles. We have around 309 ALBs, and we're about to publish a much more modernised public directory. I think one of the challenges has been actually ascertaining how many have we got and what do they do. So that has been a fundamental part of the work that's been...
So we are expecting
underway.
Some sort of idiot's guide to arm's length bodies with all the questions about ALBs that we're all too afraid to ask. Like, how many?
Indeed.
What do they do?
What
Why do they do it?
Indeed, that's it. That is the intention of a much more simple public directory that
and
we will curate.
And is Santa going to be dropping this down our chimneys this year, or is this more of an Easter Bunny present?
It should be very shortly, I hope.
So this could be on bookshelves for Christmas.
It might be the Christmas gift that you are most hoping for.
I shall add it to my Dear Santa letter as soon as I have the opportunity to do so.
But public bodies are responsible for a huge amount of money. It's around £350 billion. About 2/3 of that is immediately granted on into other layers of the state. So it really, really matters that we've got the sponsorship, the performance and the value for money of those public bodies correctly set up. So you asked about the review. It's worth just setting out some of the things that we've been doing in the last year, because that's all been alongside the review. So we've got a sponsorship code of good practice. We've undertaken corporate function benchmarking, which we started a couple of years ago, because one of the challenges of lots of these ALBs is they've all got back offices, they've all got their own corporate activities, and we've been looking to right size and to share data about what we think about back office functions. And we're currently doing an evaluation of the effectiveness of the work that we've actually done in the Cabinet Office as well, because the NEO did an excellent report a couple of years ago just setting out actually the Cabinet Office approach needed more work. We were overly bureaucratic. So what we found is there's been 104 reviews launched. We've identified £105 million worth of potential savings. And we've also identified that there's a real need to get into the scope and the breadth of how we classify our public bodies. We cover everything from regulatory activity right through to the NHS and huge delivery arms. So segmenting those public bodies, knowing why we've set them up, looking for opportunities for consolidation and sharing better practice and joining up to deliver more value for money is the substance of what we found.
Can I just clarify, and this may delay publication, but we refer, of course, to public bodies. They're distinct from arm's length bodies. An actual iterative, up-to-date reference tone for both would, I think, be enormously helpful. And you said in your earlier or initial answer to this question, around 309. Which I think just sort of almost indicates the scale of the issue here. As of this morning, because some Secretary of State may very well have created two between 9 o'clock and 10:42. But this is an issue, I think, for society to actually know who is doing what and why, and the quantum of that. And it is... it's a very big task to try and get a definitive compendium.
It really is. And I should say we have a very small team who oversee all of this. So our role for public bodies policy and reviews hasn't changed over the last few years, but our resources to do this is not finite. So they have done a great job in pulling this together.
I take that point, but we are increasingly in a public demanding, and I support them in this, of accountability of government and governance, and of regulators and regulation. And those are perfectly legitimate aspirations in an open, pluralist democracy to have. I take the point that the team who deals with this within the Cabinet Office is small. Take that. But surely it is one of the most basic toolkits that society should expect to see. We used to have something called the Civil Service Yearbook back in the day, which everything was in there and you could get hold of anybody you wanted to. But the fact that we don't, and they do exercise such enormous influence over so many people's day-to-day lives, and there isn't a go-to book.
Well, I would take back your comments about the why, but this is intended to be the directory so that you can see on a timely basis what these bodies are.
This is both public and ALBs?
Indeed. And what I don't want the committee to sort of take away is the idea that there isn't also a lot of transparency about our ALBs, so of course, and public bodies. So, they are all subject to the same transparency, accountability requirements as any other public organisation. And the departmental approach to sponsorship means that every single government department is accountable for making sure that they are creating and using public bodies to the best effect and that they're offering value for money for what they're doing. So in the Cabinet Office, I mentioned some of my public bodies and ALBs earlier. It's my responsibility to make sure that we're only setting up and using ALBs in the right way, that we're regularly reviewing them, that we're assessing their performance, which we do on an annual basis. So there is a huge amount of scrutiny at departmental level, and it's a classic example of where the Cabinet Office is there to provide guidance and support and transparency at global level, but it really is over to departments to be accountable for their bodies on a more local basis.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to Charlotte King. Can I just, forgive me, there were two secondary housekeeping points in the first one. I didn't ask for declarations of interest. I know, Charlotte, you have a register. We'll take a register of interest, which we'll just take as read on that and take it as noted. And Mr. Lamb, feel free to chip in if you wish to, because I know you weren't here with the pre-meeting due to a prior meeting, so that's absolutely fine. Let's turn now to Charlotte Kane. Charlotte.
Thank you, Chair. My questions relate to the staff survey largely, and you touched on it in your opening remarks, and you've touched on culture several times through it. So, do you now understand why Cabinet staff were reporting such higher levels of discrimination and bullying than other government departments? And why fewer of them thought that any complaints would be investigated properly?
So this is, as I said earlier, one of my big priorities, and it was of my predecessor as well. So we have had a dedicated support package in place, which has been externally led, looking at the causes of bullying and harassment within the department. And there isn't a one single driving factor. I come back to, I've got 40 different business units, but culture and my team's feeling that we operate in a very high pressured hierarchical organisation, feeling that they can't say or challenge constructively in the organisation is a common theme, and I am passionate about creating a culture where there is psychological safety and openness so that people can both share their views but also just shout when there's a problem. That is fundamental to any organisation, and I'm happy to share some of the wider things that we are doing. So we can see over time, if you look at the trend, the Cabinet Office has always had a higher level of bullying and harassment as far as the data goes back in the People Survey, and I think why is that? I think there is something about being at the very heart of events. So in 2022, the overall People Survey for the Cabinet Office dipped dramatically, and there were a lot of things happening in 2022. We managed the transition of 3 Prime Ministers in 2 months, significant shifts in policy and delivery, and I think to acknowledge the fact that that has an impact on people and it takes time to recover is an important thing. We've had, as I say, this dedicated package, and they've been working with the business units with the lowest scores, and we have seen some improvement. We're just digesting all of the People Survey results that have just been released for this year, and it does show that where we've really driven change at individual level, it is starting to bear fruit, but we are really at the start of some long-term cultural change for the department as a whole.
I understand what you're saying about some of the pressures that might make people feel less comfortable, less valued, but I'm not quite sure how those pressures would lead to higher levels of discrimination.
So, bullying, harassment and discrimination, how people feel about fairness and inclusion, it's actually quite difficult. So the way the questions are asked, it doesn't necessarily disaggregate. There's a very big difference between bullying and discrimination. So a lot of this comes back to how people feel and fairness. And you mentioned, do people feel that there's a process that they are confident will reach a conclusion? Well, I was looking at the stats on our casework and complaints. About 76% of our complaints do lead to some sort of action being taken, and I think I've got a responsibility to kind of share and be much more open about actually what happens. It's incredibly difficult to go into it. We won't ever go into individual cases, but just looking at how the process does deliver results and does make a difference is important. And I don't think staff have always been privy to all of that information. I think they should be.
So when you have an investigation and you have an outcome and you take action, do you sort of stand back from that and look at wider lessons to be learnt for the department?
Always, and I sit down with our complex case team on a very regular basis to understand the themes coming from our caseload, and I have, even in my time so far, I've asked for very specific reviews of specific cases which have been more troubling to me, and I've wanted to get someone independent to have a look at it. We've also recently asked, so we've got a lot of independent support, and I've asked other departments to come and have a look at what we're doing, especially those departments who've been able to tackle some of their challenges over time.
And do you feel you're always able to take the actions you think should be taken, or are there any untouchable people or areas that you're not able to address?
Yeah, I'm the permanent secretary. I'm entirely able and responsible to make those decisions, but I can't change the culture on my own. That has to be a whole department approach, and I need every single member of our leadership team in the same place about the culture, tone and the behaviour that we accept. So I've recently relaunched the very specific leadership behaviours that I expect of all of our senior leaders, and we have a lot, and we are publicly and openly setting out our commitments personally on our intranet at this moment in time. I launched them last week. I think it's so important that people can hold us to account for specific behaviours, and if we fall short, they should be able to call us out.
And then moving on, but possibly connected, you seem to have more staff wanting to leave, either immediately or in the next 12 months than other organisations. What are you doing to try and keep those staff?
Well, firstly, I think there's sort of good turnover and there's bad turnover. There's a question about what is the desirable level of turnover, and it's very different between our secretariats, where actually we encourage people to come on secondments for 2 to 3 years. We want to see quite a lot of porosity of people coming into the centre and then moving on to different things, as opposed to the Office for Parliamentary Counsel, where you really, really want experienced, long-serving legal drafters within that team. So we've got a very broad range of desirable levels of turnover. I think the data that you're referring to that's in the public domain is the churn rate of 25 to 30%, which is sort of what we experienced between 2019 and 2023. As at Q2 this year, we're at 14.3%. So there has already been quite a significant reduction in turnover overall. And I think it's worth noting for the Cabinet Office, because of our slightly unique composition, it includes all of our MOG changes, that turnover data. So when I move 2,000 people to DSIT, that will cause a spike in my turnover data. It includes all of our fast streamers, which we rotate actively on a 6-month basis. So that has a big impact on our numbers. And it also includes special advisors for the whole of government and our commercial staff, which, so that just means the Cabinet Office does look different and stands out. Mm. If you take out all of those things, our turnover rate comes down to about 9%. And the civil service average is 7.5%. So that is much more within the normal turnover rate that you would expect for a healthy organisation.
But you are getting comparatively low scores on leadership and development compared to other departments. Does that come to what you were talking about with your behaviour code of senior leadership?
Yeah, I think it's all connected. The question of, do you trust your leadership to take action, to listen to you, to take on board your views, to help you to thrive and succeed in your job every day? I mean, those things have an impact on how people feel fairly treated, how engaged they are, and what they think about the leadership of the organisation. So I think they are connected, but as I say, there was a very, very big dip. Like, we went down to, I think it was 58%, potentially lower in 2022. So we've been making steady progress, and I'm very encouraged by the most recent set of scores, which will become public in January. But we've got a lot to do.
Thank you.
Thank you. I've got a couple of colleagues who wish to come in. I'll take John Grady first and then Lauren. John.
Thank you. Just following up on Ms Kane's questions, and obviously it's very important, but you've got a very firm commitment to this topic. That's very comforting. But just on the measurement of this, I think if I understood you correctly, you said that because bullying, discrimination and harassment are sort of coalesced together in the questions, that it's a bit of a struggle to unpick what we're dealing with in the numbers themselves. I mean, are you planning to change the measurement so we're very clear about, the amount of actual bullying as opposed to discrimination and harassment? So you're measuring all three separately? Because that's a question in the staff survey, isn't it? That's what needs fixed there.
So the staff survey, which is the annual people survey, which we undertake, it's one of the largest surveys of its kind in the country, and involves 500,000 people annually providing data, is only one source of evidence and data that we use. We use it to help guide our understanding and insight into this. But my experience of getting beneath the skin of BHD is you've got to talk to people. And the data helps you to kind of focus your efforts and which teams you need to most spend time with. But we've had a dedicated team who have been sitting alongside those teams with the lowest scores, talking to staff in a very objective, independent way and better understanding what's driving those issues. And a lot of it is about how safe people feel to speak their mind. I run weekly open door sessions where staff can just come and talk to me confidentially, and I had a member of staff a couple of weeks ago say to me, I had a very senior member of staff sat in my desk in one of our buildings, and I was too afraid to go and say, oh, by the way, that's my desk. Like, it's those things that add up to make people feel that senior people aren't open to treating people in the same way that they would want to be treated.
And just coming back to the question, if I may, are there plans to change the questions that we ask so that we're clear as to whether people are experiencing bullying, which is different to discrimination, which is different to harassment?
Yeah.
Because I think the targeted, may I say, in my own experience, the targeted response to each of those three things would be different from a HR perspective, as I know you'll understand much better than me, Ms Little.
No, you're quite right. So we are actually just currently looking at how we use the people survey. I mentioned this is a huge annual data collection exercise. Most organisations have moved away from these very large comprehensive data. We're using data, AI, much faster pulse information to get a sense of how people feel. And I think the civil service needs to move more towards live, much more specific, much more data-driven, much more technologically platformed ways of engaging and understanding our staff. So we're currently reviewing the people survey and how we use it.
If I may follow up one crisp question.
Crisp question. Right.
Would I be right in thinking that everyone in the department has to have mandatory training on behaviours such as bullying, discrimination and harassment, and that everyone in the department is absolutely clear that, consistent with employment law, if you cross thresholds you can face very serious consequences for bullying, harassment or discrimination, including dismissal?
So every single line manager has got clear expectations and understands the standards that we expect, and we have made available bullying, harassment and discrimination training for everybody, and that includes fairness and inclusion as well as some of the more cultural aspects of leadership. And
is that just, if you'd indulge me, Mr. Chair, is that something that's followed up? So if you haven't done it, you're told you've got to do it?
That is a very good question. I'm not sure that we have done that actively, so I will go away and check how mandatory it has been.
Thank you very much.
Lauren.
Thank you. I think from your answers it's very clear that you have a strong commitment to having a really strong culture at the Cabinet Office, which is fantastic. You have referenced in some of your answers obviously challenging periods in government when there's been a lot going on. I think 2022 was mentioned. I'm just wondering to what extent, in your view, individual ministers are responsible for being part of setting the culture change within their department.
Leadership in our world has got to be set jointly between political and official leaders, and actually one of the first things that the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster did was do a session with me on just explaining the tone, the culture, the ways of working with all of our staff, and we have a monthly all-staff, and ministers regularly come along. In fact, we've done a big all-ministerial session to talk about exactly that. Ministers set the tone as much as our political leaders, as our officials do.
And in terms of, just one more if I may, in terms of those conversations with him, what sort of was your advice around sort of what you saw needed to change within the Cabinet Office in terms of culture and in terms of him being part of that conversation and that setting of a new culture? What was your advice, or what would your advice be to him about what needs to change? Obviously, a new government is an opportunity to reset that culture, and I'm just wondering what you thought needed to change based on previous years' experience.
Indeed. So the CDL, which is our sort of common parlance for the Chancellor, it's quite a mouthful to say it every single time. So the CDL has very much... it's quite interesting. One of the first questions he asked me was about the culture and ways of working, and he is very actively interested in what's driving our BHD in fairness and inclusion. So in many ways, I've not had to give him much advice because he has very instinctively sort of taken it as a personal leadership commitment to look at this and to understand it. But my advice to all ministers is to make sure that we understand the different cultures and different bits of what we do, so that we can motivate and best engage with our staff and get the most out of them. And it is different working with our secretariats, and in particular in national security, to how we operate in some of our operational teams. And I've been so encouraged by how our political leaders have really taken the time to visit those teams and to talk to them about how they feel up and down the country.
Did you have any specific advice around some of the statistics that we've been discussing in terms of bullying, harassment? Did you have any advice about what you felt needed to change from the top?
Culture and an openness, listening to staff, making it clear that we want people's views and we want to hear what people have to say, and that there are no bad ideas or any bad questions. And also a topic we discuss a lot in relation to innovation is sort of how do you create a culture where people can say, Minister, something's going wrong, and I need to tell you about why I think it's not going well and what I think we need to do to change it. We've also talked about the importance of being receptive to having those conversations and making it okay. Because when you're dealing with some of the complex and difficult things that we deal with, there's no wonder that quite often things don't go to plan, and we have to course correct and we have to learn from it and do things differently. So creating a culture with ministers where teams know they can escalate and run issues up the chain is really important.
Thank you. It's helpful knowing that was needed.
I'm sure we can touch on that with the CDL next week when he appears before us. Richard, quickly.
Thank you, Chair. Just carrying on from Ms Edwards' questions. You said the political leadership or weather does have an impact on how teams feel. Famously, a former member of this place left post-it notes on people's desks. How do you protect the Cabinet Office from the worst behaviours, political behaviours?
Ultimately, it's not just political leaders. There are behaviours in the senior official leadership as well, and it's neither one or the other. And I think it's my job as the permanent secretary to create an environment where people can call it out and talk about it. That is the most important thing. And if people lose confidence that someone's listening and actually doing something about it, which sadly has been the case in the past, then people stop raising concerns. And in some ways, I don't know whether I should be sort of pleased that people are able to say, actually, I'm not okay and I'm not happy about how I'm being treated, and I want to tell you and I want to talk about it. I think that's a healthy discussion that we have to have in the organisation.
Thank you.
Just before we leave this, we know that there is, you've referenced fast trackers moving around the civil service every 6 months or so. We know as well that there's quite a strong imperative for people who are not fast trackers to move in between departments as and when opportunities arise. I think I'm correct to say that on these important issues of, let's just call it tone and culture, as just sort of an easy shorthand. It is very bespoke between of the mindset of the permanent secretary and their secretary of state. And when you have a fast churning cadre of people moving around between departments for a whole variety of reasons, there's a sense of Groundhog Day and having to learn and refresh and renew different aspects which are different between each department. So there must surely be some considerable merit. We refer to the civil service as a, and I don't use this pejoratively, but as a amalgam. Just to have one standard set of operating procedures and requirements when it comes to these important issues of work, rather than having bespoke ones for however many government departments that we have.
I very much agree with you on operating procedures, and quite a lot of the work, in fact my whole career in the civil service for the last decade has been all about standardising procedures, because one, it means you're treating people more fairly, two, you're taking out friction, three, you're reducing costs, and it means you can automate things in a more effective way. But as I say, I've been working at that, like in finance and HR and commercial in particular, for over a decade now, because we're starting from such a different organic starting point. And it comes back to, the civil service is 120 different separate employers, each with their distinct terms and conditions and frameworks and grading structures and operating models. And I've worked in 4 of the most different departments, and the cultures are very, very different, and the grading is very different. So people think we're this sort of amalgam of homogeneity. We're really not. The Treasury has a very different culture to the Ministry of Defence, for example.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, there must be...
And some of that variation is right.
Yeah. I mean, without creating a block of vanilla, there has to be outcome upticks, surely, to have grading, operating requirements, behaviour requirements, etc., uniform across the departments, irrespective of which they are. Because with everybody being different and bespoke and niche, it must have a negative impact, surely, on the quantum and quality of outputs.
I personally believe it does. And I didn't talk about some of my priorities in my role as coup of the civil service, but there are 4 things that we're looking at there. One is the operating model, which is what you've just described. I know that can sound a bit of kind of intangible consultancy speak, but it's basically how do we get things done around here? And if we are going to drive value for money and efficiency, standardisation, where it is right and proper that we follow common processes and we have common ways of working, have to be adopted. It's often not the most glamorous bit of what we do in government, but the work that we're doing on shared services. I'm personally very, very much of that view.
Who has the whip hand? Is it you? Do you just sort of say to all the permanent secretaries that, not at the Athenaeum, those days are gone, but but where all the permanent secretaries get together, right, look, we've done this now for so many years, it's past its sell-by date, we've got to get this centralised, we've got to get it sorted out, this is what we're going to do, all comments by 4 o'clock on Friday, and it all comes into effect at 9 o'clock on Monday. Who leads it to deliver, rather than having it just eddying around between scores of people?
You sort of just described the Civil Service Board. And this is not
Which
about...
did used to meet at the Athenaeum, but
Oh, did they? That was well before my time. Look, I mean, you can't, it is so important in an organisation with 120 employers that you get collective consensus about what are the things that we're going to do once and well together, either for operational or for outcome reasons. And we've proven in the past that we're really good at that. So, some of the work we're doing on shared services, the work that we're doing on One Big Thing and our training and learning and development, we are moving as one civil service because the Civil Service Board has agreed that those are the things that we should do together. So I currently chair that committee. It is made up of the most senior leaders of the Permanent Secretary cadre, and they are responsible for looking at the health of the civil service and our strategic reform plans and how we deliver it in practice. And, at the moment, we are doing work on the pay strategy, the operating model, the digital and technology strategy, and also the culture of the organisation, so that we can, alongside the spending review, produce a detailed 2030 vision and plan for reform of the civil service.
I think you've talked us into possibly another inquiry on that, because that sounds fascinating, and I always just worry about how does it get delivered and who measures the march to deliver it. But we will come back to that, I have little or no doubt. Let's now turn to Richard Baker, who wants to talk about digital data and
Thank you, Chair. Yes, the government's got big plans around data, and a national data library is being proposed. Our predecessor committee recommended the government should take up a joined-up approach to our public evidence base within government, and the Lisley review said there were systemic and cultural barriers to responsible data sharing between departments. So how is the Cabinet Office working to break down those barriers which currently exist to data sharing?
Look, it is one of the biggest challenges of society, and I think the Secretary of State for DCIT has said, data is the DNA of modern life, and we have got to get this right. So, as you alluded to, there are lots of different barriers. I think the 4 biggest barriers are our legacy IT systems, which store a lot of our data. The fact that our IT infrastructure in government is incredibly varied. The data quality and the curation of our data has needed much work. And as you said, culture, because you have to be in the mindset of understanding what data can do for you. So just to say a bit about each of those things. So on legacy IT, we have identified all of our legacy IT systems. In 2021 at the spending review then, we worked very closely with the digital teams to prioritise the legacy IT systems that needed to be remediated and sunsetted as effectively as possible, and there was significant investment into that work. We know that we have 319 legacy IT data assets, and they have all got remediation plans. Roughly 70-ish% of those plans are fully funded and are underway. And obviously funding is a big constraint in all of this to prioritise and keep momentum going. We have rapidly increased the use of APIs. These are the connections between different data sets that we share between government departments. So one that I developed when I first came into government was sharing data from DWP on who had benefits so that we could link it directly to legal aid casework. Okay. Those are proliferating to automate data sharing. And we've also set new data standards for the whole of government, and we are now consistently assuring how government departments are meeting those data standards. On the culture, This is a constant challenge. Last year we launched something called One Big Thing, which is the one big focus for learning and development that we want the whole of the civil service to focus on. And last year we focused it on data, to make sure that every single civil servant had access to excellent training on why data mattered, how you should use it, and how you go about sharing and drawing insight from data. Over 200,000 civil servants took part in that exercise, and we're doing a similar exercise this year on innovation. So these are vast sort of training efforts, but it's the day-to-day culture, and we need every single leader, both political and senior official, understanding the power and the importance of data.
Clearly there's a huge investment in, for example, in the UK Statistics Authority and improving availability of data. And so to realise the full value of that, I imagine it's important for that remaining 30% investment required in addressing the remediation and the legacy data issues you mentioned. That will be important to secure value from that. Are there plans in place to complete that programme and complete the funding for that programme?
And when I say the other 30% are sort of a mix of not quite fully funded but still making progress rather than no progress being made. The next phase of the spending review is quite a critical moment, because that is when we're going to zero base the whole of what we do, and to make sure that we're prioritising the funding on the things that matter most. And legacy IT, alongside the risks of cyber risk, have got to be significant priorities for us.
And finally, from me, if I may, Chair, you also mentioned the importance of sharing data standards across departments, and presumably trying as best as possible to ensure alignment of data systems as well. That's, I imagine, a huge task within government, but also, of course, for public bodies and devolved administrations as well. It must be an even bigger task. I think the Predecessor Committee identified some challenges around that. So, what progress is being made in those areas too, to ensure there's a maximum potential to capture data across government and across devolved government as well?
I should have said in my earlier answer that responsibility for this has now moved as of September to DSIT. And of course, you mentioned the National Data Library, and they've also launched the Government Data Bill. That is putting data at the heart of the whole economy, and very explicitly gets into how we are going to change the approach to data sharing across the wider public sector. So my DSIT colleagues are very much in the space of implementing that bill and making sure that we bring the National Data Library to life.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Lauren.
Thank you, Chair. My question was largely going to be around that move of a lot of the AI, data and digital responsibilities to DSIT. I'm just wondering what responsibilities for those areas the Cabinet Office has retained.
So we have whole-scale moved all of my digital data and AI teams. It's one of the largest MOGs that we're working through, and involves 1,500 people. So from day one of the machinery of government change, when it was announced in Parliament, all ministerial responsibilities for those areas were moved immediately to DSIT. The thing that remains part of our systems leadership, though, is how you actually use those skills to the end outcomes that we're trying to achieve. So those tools in themselves are not the outcomes, they are the things that enable state strategy, transformation, efficiency, mission delivery. And so the CDR chairs the interministerial group, which is a formal term for a ministerial meeting on digital, and it meets very regularly to oversee how we are harnessing the digital centre of government to deliver objectives for the state as a whole.
That's very focused then on how departments within Whitehall are cooperating around digital. Okay, that's helpful. My presumption then is that DSIT also now has the spending controls in these areas as well. Is that the case?
Yes, they've created a new digital gateway which works in partnership between DSIT, the Cabinet Office and the Treasury, because obviously a lot of digital controls also have commercial aspects, which is a core function of the Cabinet Office. So the Gateway is run as a kind of combined team, but DSIT oversee it.
Now, conscious of time, and I know that Mr Grady, as a Scottish member, needs to be in for...
I'll stay.
Mr Baker, forgive me, in which case we don't necessarily need to move to the quick fire round, but we might just try it. Let's do a quick fire round and see what happens. Mr Grady, the floor is yours.
Okay, just one follow-up, just if I may, on that previous chapter. On the One Big Thing training, you had around 200,000 of a civil service family taking part. But if I'm right, there's about...
2,000, I thought you said.
200,000.
200,000. But if I'm right, you've got about 500,000 civil servants. So that's a delta of 300,000. What accounts... why would the other 300,000 not have participated in this?
That's a very good question. And we are doing some post-training evaluation. There'll be lots of different reasons. I mean, training, sort of sheep dipping 500,000 people on data is quite an immense task, and not everyone will think they need it. So we do have tens of thousands of data specialists in government, ranging from data scientists through to data engineers. There will be a large number of people who might have thought, I don't think I need the basic training. But yeah, it's a good question, and we do offer other training.
Yeah, I would express a slight amount of scepticism that over 50% don't need it, because data quality flows from people working for the DWP in Glasgow or Newcastle, or prison officers working in prisons. It's the micro makes the macro, doesn't it, in this context? So it's just, it would strike me as something that would be worth being looked at.
I completely agree, and it was the first time we've ever done anything at scale across the whole of the civil service, so we are going to keep going. But no, I think it's a fair point.
Okay. Do you think data management is as interesting as compliance? And do you think data management is interesting in the psyche as sort of compliance? People usually reach for a mug of Horlicks and a comforting blanket. I.e., they don't understand the urgency of something.
I think there's definitely a bit of that. I mean, we talked about some of the cultural challenges. Like, data can feel like quite an intangible thing to a lot of people. If you're a prison officer on the front line of a very challenging, pressured environment, of course you'll care about data, but will it be your number one priority? Maybe not. So, I think culture and understanding and giving people space and time to really kind of get to grips with it matters.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Ms. Missel. So the civil service has grown significantly since 2016. In your views, is it too big?
So it's worth looking at why it's so big, and it is big. 513,000 full-time equivalent members of staff. There are 4 big drivers of it, some of which are commonly known. So EU exit, quite a large amount of repatriation of activity from the EU into our kind of core state functions. COVID, we saw massive increases in the numbers of people, particularly in the centre of government. And there's also just been a lot of operational demand. So 2 departments I'd give as an example. The DWP, we invested in significant increases in work coaches after the pandemic, and I think rightly so, to help get people back into work and to really invest in sustainable. Well, what I do know is that these are big, ambitious things, and success is always varied. But it was necessary after the pandemic, and it was a government choice to do so, to really put effort into getting people back to work. That needs more work coaches. And, Home Office immigration enforcement has seen significant increases in people as well. And the fourth area that people might not realise is... sorry, go on.
No, I'm sorry to interrupt. I was just going to make an observation, if I may, on this sort of COVID thing. I can hear people at home, don't worry, I haven't got voices in my head, but I can hear people who go, for God's sake, COVID was years ago. that was a long, long time ago. Are we right to think that the sort of COVID fallout thereof has become the sort of almost all too easy and handy peg to hang lots of things on, and it's become more a one-off time-limited pandemic appears to be having endemic impacts on how we're governed, how we approach things, the role of the citizen in the state, why the civil service is so large. In most people's mind, it's ancient history now.
Well, I'm merely explaining why those peaks have happened since, certainly since the post-World War II low of 2016. Those are the events that have driven increases. And, I completely understand why anyone looking at the civil service would say, well, why are those people still there? And one of my frustrations is getting beneath the data, because it's not as though when we recruited in the pandemic, we sort of put a tag on someone and said, well, you were a pandemic resource. A lot of staff developed expertise and skills, which we've now redeployed into other areas. So, it's very difficult to actually trace where those upticks have led to lasting staff changes and where they haven't. So I can rationally top-down explain how that growth
is not that
happened.
difficult. Somebody joins during a pandemic, they're still on the payroll, and they've moved from there to there. They were doing that, and they're now doing this. That's not a difficult exercise to do in HR.
It is for 513,000 people, and not everyone recruited during the pandemic was recruited specifically for the pandemic. There was normal recruitment being undertaken as well. So, our data, I talked about some of our data sharing on back office functions. Like, we do not have a single HR system for the whole of the civil service. There are hundreds of them underlying the way in which we run the service. So I think there's I do think there is a big data challenge. And I think you've oversimplified it. They're the reasons for it. And the other one I was going to mention is just there have been some big machinery of government changes. So we brought the community rehabilitation centres for probation back into the boundary of government. I think the other thing that's quite unique about the civil service is where the scope and the boundary sit. So we have public servants, crown servants and civil servants, and the civil service is only 8% of the total public sector workforce. And I think, if you ask the average person, what do you think a civil servant is, they probably wouldn't tell you that it was the Royal Fleet Auxiliary or a prison officer. You would normally associate the civil service with policy development and less some of our operational boundaries. So I think there's a real misconception about what the civil service actually does, and I really think we should do more to explain it.
John, the floor was yours.
Yeah, so I suppose to sum that chapter up, that question, in a way, one of the issues you face with using the civil service numbers as some sort of pointer towards government efficiency or inefficiency is actually it's fairly meaningless when you pick away at it, because you've got policy people and prison officers, and so there's such a wide variety of people in it. But with the public spending restrictions, do you see a need to reduce headcount in the civil service?
I think it's absolutely imperative that the civil service becomes more efficient, more productive, and takes advantage of technology to become less dependent on people. And so one of the things that we'll be doing alongside the spending review is developing the first strategic workforce plan for the civil service. And I think it's too simple to talk about inputs. You've got to look at what are the outcomes and the services that the government is asking the civil service to deliver. And then the very important question of, are you delivering those outcomes in the most efficient, effective way? Harnessing technology and innovation is critical. And we do need to get clear about actually stopping some things. We have, even in my time in government, just continued to add to the list of services and activities that the civil service is asked to deliver.
So if I was to sum that up to someone back in my constituency, your position is that we need to probably do less or different things, better, and that may be associated with a reduction of headcount and or redeployment of people to the things that we should be doing from the things we shouldn't be doing. Yeah.
And it has to work in tandem with the work we're doing on reducing consultancy and contingent labour as well.
Taking words out of my mouth for the next bit of questioning. And if you were to, one question I would ask is, if you do have a series of reorganisations and moving people around and redundancies in the civil service, how can you be sure that you'll retain key capabilities and competences within the civil service? As opposed to losing really good people, which is actually what happens a lot in restructuring. You lose older, really experienced people.
I think we have definitely seen that in the past. So a number of departments have already launched what we call a voluntary exit scheme, which is giving staff the choice to leave the civil service or the department. And how you design those voluntary exit schemes really, really matters. So there are things that we can do, for example, for eligibility to those schemes, to say if you are rated as high performing or exceeding your objectives, we can say you're not eligible for the scheme. So there are ways to do it, but it's really, in my experience, having run several of these restructures and schemes, it is all down to line managers knowing what skills they need and being very, very clear about their long-term structures and what they're trying to achieve.
And then moving on to the consultancy spend and the reduction of that, what do you think the government needs to do to reduce that consultancy spend whilst making sure that the outputs of government increase or at least stay the same?
Yeah. So you'll be familiar with the halving of consultancy, £550 million to be saved by the end of this year. These are vast and important sums of money. We've just got to stop. I think, I genuinely believe that there has been an over-reliance on using consultants as additional resource because it's fast. We did a lot of it during the pandemic, and I think we have become overly reliant on reaching to what has been seen as an easy solution. I think there are three things that the civil service has to do alongside the work to reduce costs, and that's one, we've got to develop the skills where we've been most reliant on consultants, which tends to be in technology, digital and data. So we've already doubled the number of people in that profession within government. We're going to have to double it again. I think we've got to genuinely prioritise. We just don't have the money, and you would know in business, if you don't have the money, you don't do it. Yeah. And then thirdly, we have got to commission cross-cutting consultancy. Quite often I see different departments using consultants to give them advice on very similar things. And so one of the reasons we have commercial oversight over a lot of what we do in this space is so that we can kind of join up the dots and go, you should just commission this once, if you really need to commission it at all.
I wonder if there's two other things that are worth looking at, and I'll be guided by you on this. The first actually takes us back to the culture point we were discussing earlier, where we had a chap discussing bullying and harassment and so on. And I wonder whether actually part of it is, if you have less of that, you have more confident civil service who are actually prepared to take decisions themselves rather than feel that they've got to send work out to consultants. But the second thing is... this is an old theme. Fulton, the Fulton report commissioned by Harold Wilson, talked about how the civil service prizes a generalist culture with breadth of experience, and Jonathan Slater more recently has talked about a focus on generic skills of advising as opposed to deeper policy expertise. And I'm slightly biased. I'm a former lawyer, so I think you've got to know your stuff and be able to advise on it clearly. But is there a need to focus on developing specialists in the civil service who are rewarded for being jolly good at being specialists, sticking with, say, for example, education or treasury, as opposed to being rewarded for moving on and taking a different job at a different grade, doing something different?
I very much agree with both of those points. On the culture, I do think the civil service needs to be more confident. We have got a vast number of deep specialists and some of the world's and countries' leading specialists in some of the things that we do. And we've got to, we have done it in the past, with our scientists and our medical advisors, we need to do it consistently, and I really want the civil service to be confident in their specialist skills. But I personally don't think that the civil service should talk about being generalists. We are professional policy advisors, and our policy profession is a unique set of skills, and I think far too many of the civil service don't quite know which profession they fit into at times. So that continuing drive to professionalise and to accredit skills and to give confidence to the capability of our people really, really matters. And I'm biased as well because I'm an accountant, but I think that really does make a difference to the way in which you operate.
I want to finish this session at about 1:45. Peter, you wanted to come in very briefly?
I've got to leave. We've got another meeting now, I'm afraid.
Okay. Luke?
Yes, just to make
very
quick point, and we're coming back to the line of questioning from the chairman. I don't think it's remotely credible to say that you don't know when people started. I think that's a ludicrous thing to say, and that worries me. And I think that kind of highlights this lack of kind of understanding of the workforce, and I think requires corrective actions to be able to answer that question.
If I could just clarify, I'm not saying that I don't know where someone started. Every single government department knows exactly when someone was recruited. What I'm saying is that we did not put people into buckets of COVID resource and non-COVID resource because we were recruiting for lots of different reasons. And I certainly don't have the means to aggregate that data in that way thematically.
We don't know what job title they were recruited under.
But job titles isn't necessarily the best way to ascertain what someone's doing, I'm afraid.
It's like a very good way to understand what they're doing to me, but anyway, maybe I'm misunderstanding.
Not necessarily. Quite a lot of our staff have common descriptors, and during the pandemic we brought in lots of new operational teams who were work coaches. We didn't put on their job title work coach COVID. So I think you are overly simplifying the importance of making sure that we get better data. I completely agree with that. We have got to have better data on our workforce consistently understood across the whole of government, which is a really big part of our shared services programme. But that I think you've misrepresented what I was saying in response to the Chair's question.
I think there is, and this is not reserved to the public sector. I think it's across the piece. I think that there is a legitimate and growing concern that a all hands to the pump response to a challenge of a unique pandemic set of circumstances, where enormous expectation was placed upon the efficacy of the state to deliver, support, protect, has somehow there's never been a pause button on that to say that was a response to a unique set of circumstances. And we are now dealing with an endemic way of both doing things and legacy of recruitment, which nobody has ever gone back and done the root and branch work that actually needed to be done. And as I say, I think this is happening in the private sector as well. Too many, since COVID, we do it like this, or since COVID, we don't do that. I think people are getting heartily cheesed off with the since COVID. You might as well say since the Black Death, since the Second World War, since the invasion of the Falklands. These are historic events which had a response, but it shouldn't be an endemic, hard-baked.
I very much agree with that.
I rather presumed you would. I think we will look to be convinced and or assured that there is the urgency and agency across the machine at both political and civil servant and the wider sector level, that is a piece of work that not only needs to be done, but there is merit in the doing.
Well, I hope you are assured that this is a very critical piece of work. And it's not straightforward, right? But we are going to produce a strategic workforce plan that looks at the size, shape, skills, cost of the civil service, and that will go alongside the spending review. And we are going to look at this bottom up across the whole of what we do.
I'm not quite sure. There seems to be a public bars emptying bottle service going on outside. Could somebody just go and ask our glass recycling friends to recycle a little more quietly? Right. God almighty, somebody had a good party. Richard Quigley, I'm going to turn to you now.
Yes, back to the point around recruiting and retaining the best people. Civil service pay has fallen in real terms quite considerably over the last few years. Is that having an impact on your ability to recruit and retain?
I think in some areas it is. I don't. Pay is only part of the recruitment and retention challenge, and I think I'd observed that the civil service is competing with other parts of the state in different ways. And actually, we tend to have big challenges at senior leadership level in specialist areas, but also increasingly at more junior levels where we are competing with the broader economy. So it is definitely a factor, which is why we're looking at the reward strategy, why we're looking at diversifying our recruitment, trying to attract people into different skills. We're segmenting our pay more and more. So you'll know that we've already done that for a large number of our functions. But I think, equally, we don't do enough to celebrate the total reward offer that the civil service gives. Like, we have some of the most interesting and rewarding work in the public sector. It's a huge privilege every single day. And when you look at our total reward of pension and pay, our pensions are significantly above what you would get within the private sector. And I don't think we're good enough at talking about the total compensation and reward package.
And my understanding as well is from IFG information is that the average time in post for senior staff is about 2 years, which may or may not cause problems. But the idea is that you say, well, Mr. Hall, you're exceptionally good at your job, but we can't do any, of course, we can't do any in-job progression, salary progression, so we're going to promote you and off you pop to another department. Would you like to return to in-job pay progression to try and cement skills?
I think we've definitely got to look at pay progression because it is undoubtedly one of the drivers of turnover. And that's not just anecdotal. I think there's quite a lot of evidence. So it's one of the questions we'll have to look at.
Do you think it's causing grade inflation? Somebody say, well, we'll put you up a grade because we can't.
Yes, it's also causing grade compression. So our pay, I think my predecessor said to this committee previously, pay is in a terrible state, and it is the biggest challenge that sits underneath all of the issues that the civil service is facing.
The last one from me on that is then if you had a magic wand on that issue, what would you point it at?
I'm not sure there is a magic wand, and especially because it's also right that we operate within very, very tough fiscal conditions. So I think it's my job to look at pay, the operating model, to be able to release the efficiency savings to reinvest in pay. And I think that's part of the challenge here is people always look for short-term, piecemeal, tactical solutions to the challenges that we've got. And my personal contention is these are actually quite pervasive and significant issues that need significant long-term, serious thought.
Thank you. Anything else?
No, I'm fine. Thanks, Chair.
Let's have a few minutes, please, on EU relations, and I can ask Lauren to lead on that.
Thank you very much, Chair. I just wanted to raise a little bit. You spoke earlier in in your contributions around areas that you've lost and areas that you've gained. Obviously, aware that the EU Relations Secretariat has come across has sort of been created recently, and we've had about 50 staff come across to the Cabinet Office, I think about a month ago. So just interested from your point of view, firstly, how they're embedding, how you're making sure that they are sort of fitting into the Cabinet Office culture that you have, and what you see as the kind of challenges for them going forward.
So about a month ago, as you say, just over 40 members of staff came from the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. I went to talk to them on day one to kind of understand their hopes and fears. It's a big thing moving from a department, especially when you've been in the diplomatic service and your career path has been largely sort of destined within a different sort of career framework. So I think, people are really genuinely interested in how the Home Civil Service and the Cabinet Office differs to what is a fairly different way of managing talent and people. But of course, we've worked together really closely for a very long time. So for many of those staff, they've actually been physically sort of sat working with our international and national security teams in project-based environments for many years. So it's quite interesting how for many people it's not a massive change. And of course it wasn't that long ago that we did have an EU secretariat within the Cabinet Office, and there are some people in that group who are returning to the Cabinet Office, having been part of it for many, many years. So I think when you're facing quite a mix of different skills, and of course some big challenges in taking forward the substance of the policy work, we're going to be staying very close to that team to make sure that they've got the right integration, the right tools, and the right support to thrive.
Mm-hmm. What do you see as their kind of focus over the next 6 months? What's your sort of direction to them in terms of settling into role?
Yeah, so obviously settling sort of some of the policy considerations. There's a lot of work in that space, and I won't go into the detail because quite a lot of this is in development, and you've probably seen that we're recruiting a new second permanent secretary to lead on EU relations. So there's just a lot of work, and we've got a lot of global and EU interactions, and we have done over the last few weeks, which I'm sure you've seen. So sort of settling people in whilst there's quite a lot of work going on is always the challenge.
Thank you. Wonderful. Thank you very much indeed. You've given us much food for thought. You have answered our questions openly, for which we are hugely appreciative. We will see you again next week with the CDL. So this was the sort of warm-up act, if you will, for the great
the real event
for the great show next week. So I'll say order for now, but thank you very much indeed.
So much.
Thank you.